We will get started in just a moment. Welcome and thanks for joining today as we take an in-depth look at changes in policy regarding eligibility criteria for the alternate assessment and its implications for pupil appraisal staff and IEP teams. We'll end the webinar with some commonly asked questions regarding the use of alternate assessment participation criteria. Before we get started, I'd like to thank both the Louisiana Psychological Association and the Louisiana School Psychological Association for contributing their time and expertise in the development of this webinar. As you take a look over the agenda, I just need to cover a few logistics for the webinar. First, if you're experiencing any audio difficulties, please make sure your speakers are on and your volume's at a suitable level. The call will be in the listen-only mode to ensure we get through the information. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box. If time permits, we'll stop and answer questions as we go along. However, we may not be able to respond to all the questions during the webinar. If you click on your chat box icon, you'll see a link in the chat box to the Louisiana Department of Education Students with Disabilities Resource Library. That'll allow you to download a reader-friendly version of the revisions to Bulletin 1530's alternate assessment eligibility criteria. The document is titled Bulletin 1530, Preliminary Revisions Webinar Document. It can be found under the Special Education Related Bulletins/Policy Guidelines section of the Resource Library. This version of the document will be helpful when we get to the slides covering the BESE approved revisions to the Bulletin. The purpose of this webinar is to provide a brief history of alternate assessment to better understand the current BESE approved alternate assessment eligibility criteria revisions to Bulletin 1530. We'll also discuss the implications that the current approved revisions have on the work and decision making of pupil appraisal and IEP teams. In addition, we'll review SIR documentation requirements and cover some commonly asked questions. To conclude the webinar, we will share some current resources and supports that are now available and updates on guidance that is currently being drafted to accompany the alternate assessment eligibility policy revisions. We are planning for this policy to take effect in the 2019-2020 school year. The question to keep in mind surrounding this work as we proceed through the webinar is, how do we ensure only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities participate in the alternate assessment? Here's a timeline that will help show how we continue to try to answer this question. Let's take a brief look at the history of alternate assessment, which will help set a foundation of why Bulletin 1530 was revised with regards to the eligibility criteria for alternate assessment. Looking back to 1990, we know that statewide assessment of students with significant cognitive disabilities did not exist. In the early 1990s, most states included 10% or fewer of their students with disabilities in state assessments. As a result of this, and a lack of academic assessments for students with significant cognitive disabilities, there was limited information on the educational results of students with disabilities. The first federal requirement of alternate assessment came in 1997 when IDEA was amended. IDEA previously had required that students with disabilities have access to the school building, but now students with severe disabilities were to have access to and show progress in the same challenging curriculum as their peers. In 1999, a survey conducted by NCEO showed that only 2 states reported having an alternate assessment in place, and another 20 states indicated they were developing some type of alternate assessment. In 2002, No Child Left Behind was signed by President Bush, in which states were now required to ensure that school systems test at least 95% of all students, including students with disabilities. By 2003, nearly all states had at least one alternate assessment in place and were permitted to measure achievement for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities based on alternate standards. The use of alternate achievement standards not only ensures that students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are appropriately included in state accountability systems, but it also ensures that schools and LEAs receive credit for their achievement. Prior to the 2003 regulation, all students had to be assessed based on grade level achievement standards. During this time, states become responsible for developing criteria to define students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. In 2003, regulations for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, reauthorization of 2001, allow for proficient performance on alternate achievement standards to be counted in with proficient performance on grade level achievement standards. The 2003 ESEA regulations placed a limit of 1% on accountability proficiency rates for the alternate assessment. This was not a limit on participation in the alternate assessment. Participation rates in states grew during this time, with states' goal of achieving at least the federally required 95% participation rates by all students and subgroups, including students with disabilities. Participation in the alternate assessment was less than 1% of the total tested population in nearly every state prior to the enactment of the 2003 accountability regulations on proficiency rates. 35 of the 38 states that provided participation data indicated that less than 1% of the total tested population took the alternate assessment. 21 of these 35 states reported a rate of less than 0.5%. Alternate assessment participation rates have increased steadily since 2003. By 2008, all states had built statewide alternate assessment systems. In 2005, ESEA was reauthorized as the Every Student Succeeds Act. ESSA reaffirmed that the alternate assessment is an appropriate assessment for students with the most cognitive significant disabilities to demonstrate their knowledge and skills. But rather than placing a limit on accountability proficiency rates, ESSA places a 1% state cap on participation in the alternate assessment. Any state exceeding the 1% participation cap is required to submit a waiver to the federal government. Although states are held to a 1% cap, they cannot set a cap on participation at the district level. The cap generally reflects national rates, but it may not account for more localized differences in the number of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. The aim of this 1% cap on participation in the alternate assessment is to hold students to the highest standards by ensuring students are taking the most appropriate assessment. This research information I'm about to share is not on this slide, but it's relevant to the work surrounding how we better ensure only students with the most significant disabilities participate in the alternate assessment. As participation rates increased, researchers noticed unusual patterns of participation. Students with learning disabilities and speech impairments were participating in the alternate assessment. Students with these labels were not expected to be among those participating in the alternate assessment, which raised questions about the clarity of states' alternate assessment participation guidelines. These findings caused concern, which was heightened by evidence that students participating in the alternate assessment were more likely to be placed in segregated educational settings. Although the alternate assessment was the appropriate assessment for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, researchers were finding that students without significant cognitive disabilities were also participating in it. ESSA's establishment of the 1% participation cap in 2015 is consistent with research showing that some students assigned to the alternate assessment more appropriately should have been assessed with the general assessment. In an effort to ensure only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities participate in the alternate assessment, states must define this population of students. The term students with the most significant cognitive disabilities did not create or refer to a specific disability under IDEA. Rather, the United States Department of Education intended the term to include the small number of students within one or more of the existing categories of disability, whose cognitive impairments may prevent them from attaining grade-level achievement standards, even with the very best instruction, and who are unable to participate in the regular assessment, even with accommodations. Nationally, it's estimated that 1% of students are students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. National experts believe that about 1% of students have significant cognitive disabilities because of how cognitive scores are distributed across the population. Take a look at how this works by examining the bell curve as it relates to IQ. This can help us better understand Louisiana's current alternate assessment participation criteria and the BESE approved revisions to Bulletin 1530. The national mean IQ is 100 and standard deviations in most cases are 15 points. About 2% of the US population is between 2 and 3 standard deviations below the mean, or have an IQ of 55 to 77. 1% of the population falls below an IQ of 67, or about 2.3 standard deviations below the mean. I want to highlight this 1% of the population falling below about 2.3 standard deviations because it's a significant reference point as we look at the eligibility criteria for participation in the alternate assessment. Before we share the preliminary revisions to Bulletin 1530, we're going to take a look at the 2014 revisions. This should be familiar to everyone because it is the current criteria IEP teams are using to determine if a student is eligible to participate in the alternate assessment. In 2014, LDOE recommended the following revisions to the first criterion for determining eligibility in the alternate assessment, or at the time in 2014, the Law 1 assessment. LDOE recommended the following. Retain the 3 standard deviations or below requirement for students who have not completed 5th grade. For students who have completed 5th grade, an eligible student is functioning 2.3 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning and/or adaptive behavior. The decision to use 2.3 or more standard deviations here is consistent with what we saw in the previous slide with the bell curve, and roughly 1% of the population falls below this score. In 2014, Louisiana also included subsection C to the first criterion to better ensure that students with the most significant cognitive disabilities were taking the appropriate assessment. Subsection C says, students who have completed the 5th grade functioning between 2 and 2.29 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning and/or adaptive behavior may be eligible for alternate assessment participation if the IEP team provides additional empirical evidence and alternate assessment, or Law 1 at the time, identification is appropriate for the student. Thinking back to what we know about the bell curve and changes in legislation during this time, we can better understand why the 2014 revisions to Bulletin 1530 allowed teams to make evidence-backed decisions to ensure that only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities were eligible to participate in the alternate assessment. It's also interesting to note here that Louisiana is the only state that uses cognitive function and/or adaptive behavior as alternate assessment participation criteria. Other states use both cognitive and adaptive scores. Some states use only cognitive scores in their participation guidelines. Although the Louisiana Department of Education revised the first criterion to Bulletin 1530, they did not make significant changes in 2014 to the second or third criterion. The second criterion states that for students to be eligible to take the alternate assessment, the student requires extensive modified instruction aligned with the Louisiana extended standards to acquire, maintain, and generalize skills. The third criterion shown here ensures that the decision to include a student in alternate assessment is not based solely on one criterion alone. It represents a list of safeguards that should prevent a student from being assessed in the alternate assessment for reasons other than what the participation criteria has established. Given the historical context of alternate assessment eligibility criteria and participation, we think it would be helpful to see where we are now as a state. This slide shows Louisiana alternate assessment by preliminary numbers. 1.3% represents Louisiana's alternate assessment participation rate for spring of 2018. There are approximately 4,800 students taking the alternate assessment. Currently, 100 school systems will have to submit a justification because they exceeded the 1% threshold. This has decreased from last year. Last year, 108 traditional school systems submitted a justification. The top 3 disability categories for participation are autism, ID mild, and ID moderate, which together represent about 70% of all testers. Now that we're grounded in some history and current state numbers, these next couple of sections will focus on the alternate assessment eligibility criteria revisions to Bulletin 1530 and the steps we're continuing to take to ensure that only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities participate in the alternate assessment. This is where you may want to have a copy of the document titled Bulletin 1530 Preliminary Policy Changes handy. You can access this document through the link included at the top of your chat box or from the Students with Disabilities Resource Library on the Louisiana Believes website. This past fall, the LDOE convened a work group of experts from across the state to review the alternate assessment participation criteria outlined in Bulletin 1530. The working group's recommendations were brought to the Special Education Advisory Panel in November of 2018. SEEP endorsed these recommendations with revisions. The proposed revisions to Bulletin 1530 were brought to the BESE board in December 2018 for consideration and approval. This information is not on this slide, but the approved revisions to Bulletin 1530 address 4 parts. Delete policy language allowing students to participate in the alternate assessment based on deficits in adaptive functioning alone. Establish a transition period for graduation pathways of current high school and 8th grade students. Incorporate language from the most recent federal regulations and provide technical edits, including references to outdated assessments and standards. These revisions are anticipated to take effect for the 2019-2020 school year. Again, as we move through the new revisions to the bulletin, you may want to have the Word document version of these revisions as a reference. Prior to listing the 3 criteria that need to be met for a student to be eligible to participate in the alternate assessment, Bulletin 1530 includes Section 503 describing the alternate assessment and its intended purpose. There are not many significant changes to Sections 503 or 505 presented on this slide. The 2019 revised version of Bulletin 1530 now reads, LEAP alternate assessment was developed for students with disabilities who are served under IDEA for whom there is evidence that the student has a significant cognitive disability. The alternate assessment is a performance-based assessment designed for students whose instructional program is aligned with the Louisiana Connector standards. Section 505 now includes an introductory paragraph prior to listing the 3 criteria that need to be met for alternate assessment participation eligibility. Section 505 is titled, The Alternate Assessment Participation Criteria, and now reads, LEAP alternate assessment. To be eligible to participate in the LEAP alternate assessment, the IEP team must verify the student in grades 3 through 11 meets the criteria listed in this subsection. Changes to these first 2 sections, 503 and 505 presented on this slide, include replacing the phrase Law 1 with the phrase alternate assessment, and replacing the phrase Louisiana Extended Standards with the phrase Louisiana Connector Standards. These revisions are examples of technical edits to update references to outdated assessments and standards. Following the introductory paragraph in Section 505, the Bulletin moves into listing the 3 criteria that must all be met for a student to qualify for the alternate assessment. We're going to move through each criteria in Bulletin 1530, one at a time. Criterion 1 includes 3 subsections of assessment criteria. One of these 3 subsections of criteria need to be met for the student to meet the eligibility requirements set by this first criterion. Criterion 2 addresses requirements the student must meet regarding the need for individualized instruction and supports to achieve the Louisiana Connector Standards. And Criterion 3 is a safeguard clause to ensure only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are participating in the alternate assessment because they have met the eligibility criteria established. The current preliminary changes to Bulletin 1530 establish a transition period for graduation pathways for current 8th grade and high school students. This transition has been included in the first criterion of eligibility for the alternate assessment participation. It's important to note as we look at this eligibility criterion that it will look very familiar to everyone because for this group of students, again, we're talking students in grades 8 through high school, the criterion has not been revised and remains the same. The first criterion for this group of students has not changed. The beginning of Criterion 1 is shown here. It is followed by its 3 subsections on the next slide. This criterion establishes a transition for students currently in grade 8 through high school. The first criterion begins with the transition statement. For students entering a high school cohort on or before the 2019-2020 school year, the student has a disability that significantly impacts cognitive function and/or adaptive behavior. This may be demonstrated in the following ways, which are presented on the next slide. What we're seeing here with Criterion 1 is the establishment of a transition period for graduation pathways for current 8th grade and high school students. This transition helps to ensure graduation pathways are not interrupted by revisions to policy. In order to meet Criterion 1, students must meet criteria in one of the following subsections, A, B, or C. Again, the eligibility criteria in subsections A, B, and C applies to current 8th grade through high school students and is the same as the current criteria that has been in place since 2014. Subsection A still reads, for students who have not completed the 5th grade, an eligible student is functioning 3 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning and/or adaptive behavior. There were no revisions made to subsection A of this first criterion for students currently in 8th grade and above. Although subsection A does not apply to students currently in 8th grade and beyond because they have already completed 5th grade, this subsection remains in the policy to adhere to policy alignment. Subsection B still reads, for students who have completed 5th grade, an eligible student is functioning 2.3 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning and/or adaptive behavior. There were no revisions made to subsection B of Criterion 1 for students currently in 8th grade and above. Subsection C reads, students who have completed the 5th grade functioning between 2 and 2.29 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning and/or adaptive behavior may be eligible for the alternate assessment participation if the IEP team provides additional empirical evidence an alternate assessment identification is appropriate for the student. The only revisions to Criterion 1 is to language used in subsection C. There was a revision made to an outdated reference to the Law 1 assessment. Establishing this transition in policy allows eligibility criteria for students currently in 8th grade and beyond to remain the same. This transition ensures that current graduation pathways are not altered due to changes in policy. We just saw how the revisions to Bulletin 1530 established a transition period for graduation pathways of current high school and 8th grade students. Providing this transition in policy means that different guidelines for Criterion 1 have been established for students in 7th grade and below. This revised criterion will be applied to IEP team decisions regarding eligibility for participation in the alternate assessment beginning in the 2019-2020 school year. To the left of the slide, you will see the criteria IEP teams are currently using for students in 7th grade and below, and in the center of the slide, you will see the policy revisions that BESE approved in December for this group of students. We will take a look at the transition statement and then go through each of the 3 subsections to this first criterion. We'll look at each of the subsections A, B, and C one at a time over the next 3 slides. The information on the left of the slide should be familiar because it's the current criteria being used by IEP teams. It says that student has a disability that significantly impacts cognitive function and/or adaptive behavior. This may be demonstrated in the following ways. If we look to the center of the slide, we see the BESE approved revisions. The policy now reads, for students entering a high school cohort during the 2020-2021 school year and beyond, the student has a disability that significantly impacts cognitive function. This may be demonstrated in the following ways. Again, we'll discuss the ways on the next 3 slides. The revisions seen here added the transition entering a high school cohort during the 2020-2021 school year and beyond to clarify that this revised criterion only applies to students currently in 7th grade and below. The revisions here no longer include the statement, impacts cognitive function and/or adaptive behavior. The criterion now ends after the words impacts cognitive function and does not include adaptive behavior. The following slides will take us through each subsection of this first criterion. The subsections demonstrate how we know if a student has met Criterion 1 of the eligibility requirements to participate in the alternate assessment. This is new and different than the Criterion 1 used for students entering a high school cohort on or before the 2019-2020 school year. We're going to cover each subsection A, B, and C of Criterion 1 by looking at them one at a time because the subsections have each been revised, each is grade level specific, and each includes different requirements to assessment scores. As we look at these subsections, remember they apply to students currently in 7th grade and below. This slide presents subsection A of Criterion 1. Again, to the left, you will notice the familiar 1530 eligibility criterion language. It is there for reference as we look at the policy revisions and understand how the criterion has changed for this group of students. On the left, the requirement for subsection A reads, for students who have not completed the 5th grade, an eligible student is functioning 3 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning and/or adaptive behavior. The BESE approved changes to the policy are located in the center of the slide for Criterion 1, subsection A, and now read, for students who have not completed the 5th grade, an eligible student is functioning 3 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning. Criterion 1, subsection A, has been revised to remove the phrase and/or adaptive behavior. The requirement in this subsection now only includes measures of cognitive functioning. What this means is that IEP teams are no longer able to apply adaptive behavior scores to meet the eligibility requirements set by subsection A to the first criterion. Students who have not completed 5th grade only meet this first criterion if they have a score of 3 or more standard deviations below the mean on a cognitive assessment. Criterion 1 subsection B is shown on this slide. Again, we see the familiar Bulletin 1530 language to the left, and the BESE approved revisions in the center. On the left, the requirement for subsection B reads, for students who have completed 5th grade, an eligible student is functioning 2.3 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning and/or adaptive behavior. Current BESE approved revisions for Criterion 1 subsection B now say, for students who have completed 5th grade, an eligible student is functioning 2.3 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning. Criterion 1 subsection B has been revised and no longer allows IEP teams to apply adaptive behavior scores as part of this first eligibility criterion when determining if students currently in grades 7 and below qualify for the alternate assessment. Both Criterion 1 subsections A and B have been revised in the same way. The phrase and/or adaptive behavior has been removed. The criteria in these subsections now only includes measures of cognitive functioning. Again, this means that IEP teams are no longer able to apply adaptive behavior scores to determine if these groups of students meet the requirements of this first criterion. Again, we're still talking about the criteria that applies to students currently in 7th grade and below. Now let's take a look at the final subsection for Criterion 1 that applies to students currently in grade 7 and below. Again, to the left, we see the familiar requirements, and they read, students who have completed the 5th grade functioning 2 and 2.29 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning and/or adaptive behavior may be eligible for the alternate assessment participation if the IEP team provides additional empirical evidence an alternate assessment identification is appropriate for the student. BESE approved revisions to Criterion 1 subsection C in the center of the slide read, students who have completed the 5th grade functioning between 2 and 2.29 or more standard deviations below the mean in cognitive functioning and with deficits in adaptive behavior may be eligible for alternate assessment participation if the IEP team provides additional empirical evidence an alternate assessment identification is appropriate for the student. When applying the criteria presented in subsection C in determining eligibility, the team must not only consider cognitive functioning, but the student must also present with deficits in adaptive behavior. Remember, in the previous 2 subsections A and B, the team only considered cognitive functioning. When considering subsection C and determining if a student meets the eligibility criteria for the first criterion, the team must consider both cognitive functioning and adaptive deficits. In order for a student in grade 7 and below to meet the first criterion of eligibility, they must meet the requirements of either subsections A, B, or C of this first criterion. Remember, there are 3 criteria used to determine eligibility for the alternate assessment. Students must meet all 3 to be considered eligible to participate. We just covered the first criterion and the transition that was established for all current 8th grade through high school students. The first eligibility criterion for this group of students is not changed and allows for graduation pathways to be uninterrupted as policy changes. However, eligibility criterion 1 for our current pre-K through 7th grade students has changed. For subsections A and B of the first criterion, teams can only use scores of cognitive functioning when determining if the student has met the requirements of the first criterion. For subsection C of this first criterion, teams must consider both cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior deficits when deciding if a student has met criterion 1. We're planning for implementation of this criteria to be effective for the 2019-2020 school year. Pupil appraisal and IEP teams can begin to plan with this timeline in mind. Now we're going to take a look at revisions to criteria 2 and 3. These criteria and the revisions to them apply to all students in all grade levels. If we look to the left, we can see the current Bulletin 1530 language from 2014. The criterion reads, the student requires extensive modified instruction aligned with the Louisiana Extended Standards to acquire, maintain, and generalize skills. The BESE approved revisions now have the second criterion read, the student requires direct individualized instruction and substantial supports to achieve measurable gains on the challenging state academic content standards for the grade in which the student is enrolled. The revisions for Criterion 2 of the policy mirror the federal regulations. The regulation language suggests that a student who is eligible to participate in the alternate assessment is one who has a cognitive disability that is so significant that they need extensive, direct, individualized instruction and support to make progress on the Louisiana Connector standards. This sets a high bar for participation in the alternate assessment because it's saying that the alternate assessment would not be appropriate for a student who could demonstrate gains on the Louisiana Connectors standards without extensive individualized support. Again, this is the second of 3 criteria that all students must meet to be eligible to participate in the alternate assessment. This criterion applies to all students in all grade levels. Criterion 3, seen on this slide, is an example of revisions made to the bulletin that were needed to incorporate language from the most recent federal regulations and technical edits necessary to remove references to outdated assessments. The criterion presented here applies to all students in all grades and is the third criteria that must be met for participation in the alternate assessment. Criterion 3 is a safeguard provision that should prevent a student from being assessed in the alternate assessment for reasons other than what the participation criteria has established. If a student meets the requirements of the first 2 criteria, the IEP team must also take into consideration numerous other factors before determining eligibility for the alternate assessment. Again, this is to ensure only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are participating in the alternate assessment. There were minor updates made to this section. Letter K was added and states, the decision to include the student in an alternate assessment is not solely based on K, the student's previous need for accommodations to participate in the general state or district-wide assessments. The addition of letter K means that eligibility for the alternate assessment is not made based solely on the student's previous needs or performance in statewide assessment participation. In other words, just because a student participates in the alternate assessment does not mean they will always participate in the alternate assessment. Remember, this decision is made annually by the IEP team. Before we discuss the implications of the revisions to Bulletin 1530 on IEP teams and pupil appraisal teams, I just want to provide a brief summary of the information that was just presented. The revisions to the alternate assessment criteria established a transition for graduation pathways and resulted in the first criterion for eligibility to remain the same for students currently in grades 8 and beyond. However, the first criterion for students in pre-K through 7th grade has changed and no longer includes language that allows students to be eligible for the alternate assessment based on cognitive function and/or adaptive behavior. Students in these grades can meet the requirement for Criteria 1 based on cognitive scores alone, or as stated in subsection C of Criterion 1, the team must consider both cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior deficits, along with empirical evidence when determining participation eligibility. Criterion 2 is changed for all students in all grades. It sets a high bar for students to meet because it says that the alternate assessment would not be appropriate for a student who could demonstrate gains on the Louisiana Connector standards without extensive individualized support. Criterion 3 has also been revised for all students in all grades and continues to serve as a safeguard to ensure that only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are participating in the alternate assessment. Participation in the alternate assessment and meeting the requirements for the 3 eligibility criteria is a decision IEP teams must make annually. Remember, students in all grades must meet all 3 criteria because participation in the alternate assessment is for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. In some instances where a student meets all 3 criteria, the IEP team may still decide that participation in the regular assessment is more appropriate for that student. Now that we've covered the BESE-approved revisions to Bulletin 1530, we can focus on specific implications these policy revisions have for the work of pupil appraisal and IEP teams. The IEP team's responsibility is to determine how a student will participate in a state assessment of student achievement and whether accommodations for the assessment are required to enable the student to participate. It's important to keep in mind that IEP teams decide how a student participates, not whether a student participates. All students participate in state assessments. The IEP team also determines whether accommodations for the assessments are needed by each individual student to enable the student to participate in the assessment. BESE policy outlines specific criteria a student must meet to participate in the LEAP Connect alternate assessment. IEP teams are responsible for determining if a student should participate in the LEAP Connect alternate assessment based on the state's criteria. If the IEP team determines that a student will not participate in the regular statewide assessment, the team is required to identify why the assessment is not appropriate for the student and how the student will be assessed, such as through an alternate assessment based on the criteria in Bulletin 1530. ESSA ensures that parents of students participating in the alternate assessment are clearly informed as part of the process for developing the individual education program. Teams must inform parents that their child's academic achievement will be measured based on alternate standards, and inform parents how participation in alternate assessment may delay or otherwise affect the student from completing the requirements for a high school diploma. We know IEP teams need the right information at the right time to make an informed decision as to whether a student is eligible for the alternate assessment. To help IEP teams in the decision-making process, LDOE added enhancements to the special education reporting system this past fall that capture and display cognitive and adaptive assessment results clearly and transparently. These enhancements require pupil appraisal teams or SIR clerks to add specific elements of cognitive and adaptive evaluation results under the evaluation link in SIR. The data captured in the evaluation link is automatically added to the IEP team's LEAP Connect form, the place where the IEP team documents if the student meets the state's alternate assessment eligibility criteria. These changes to SIR allow for IEP teams to have the necessary information to make an informed decision in the IEP meeting regarding participation in the alternate assessment. The information gathered by these enhancements directly relates to Criterion 1 of the eligibility criteria. SIR currently requires the same 4 elements from cognitive and adaptive assessments. The system requires a yes or no response to indicating if the cognitive and adaptive assessments were completed, the name of the assessment administered, the date of administration, and the score reported as a standard deviation. Understanding the SIR reporting requirements is important for pupil appraisal and evaluation teams because this information will need to be included in the multidisciplinary evaluation report and easy for SIR clerks or other staff to locate in the report to ensure accurate input of data into the evaluation link in SIR. Once the information on the evaluation link is added, SIR will automatically add these results to the IEP's LEAP Connect form. This is the place where the IEP team documents that the student meets the state's alternate assessment eligibility criteria. On this screenshot, you can see how it looks. It will appear right before the checklist for Criterion 1. These evaluation scores will help IEP teams determine If the student meets eligibility criterion 1 based on standard deviation scores for cognitive functioning, and when necessary, adaptive behavior. To ensure IEP teams have the information that is required to determine if a student meets criterion 1, evaluation teams, as appropriate, need to administer valid cognitive and/or adaptive assessments to students in order to determine the presence of a significant cognitive disability. When teams administer a cognitive and/or adaptive assessment, they need to include in the evaluation report the assessment name, date of administration, and scores reported as standard deviations from the mean. This information needs to be clear and easy to locate in the written report so it can be taken from the report and entered into the evaluation section of SIR. When an assessment of cognitive functioning is administered, scores should be reported in standard deviations from the mean for the full scale IQ score. It's important that we use full scale IQ because a student's full scale score is always the most reliable measure of overall cognitive functioning. The subscales allow us to understand how students function in regards to each of the constructs being measured, but all of them work together to form a complete picture of how the student functions in his or her environment. For this reason, we do not want to enter into SIR the subscale or index scores for cognitive functioning. Some examples of subscale or index scores include scores obtained for working memory, visual processing, verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, just to name a few. We would not report these index scores in SIR and should not use subscale or index scores to determine if a student meets the requirement of the first criterion of eligibility for participation in the alternate assessment. School systems often ask how they can determine if a student meets the requirements of the second criterion for eligibility to take the alternate assessment. Remember, criterion 2 states, the student requires direct individualized instruction and substantial supports to achieve measurable gains on the challenging state academic standards Louisiana connectors for the grade in which the student is enrolled. How do IEP teams decide if a student meets this criteria? Well, we've learned from experts in the field that there are certain types of questions or discussion prompts that will help an IEP team have a rich conversation around the need for substantial supports. The discussion prompts presented on this slide are intended to help facilitate IEP team conversations around this topic. These discussion points are suggestions, and they definitely don't represent an exhaustive list. An IEP team may have other considerations, and ultimately it's an IEP team decision to determine if a student requires individualized instruction and substantial supports. When evaluation and IEP teams are discussing whether or not a student should qualify as a student with the most significant cognitive disability that requires individualized instruction and substantial support, the teams may consider and discuss what the school day looks like for the student, if the student has a reliable and established communication system. Teams may also want to consider how much time the student spends learning new material, how much time a teacher is reteaching and pre-teaching, and the level and frequency of prompting the student needs. Students who are identified with the most significant cognitive disabilities may require direct support from adult caretakers in post-secondary settings and may need assisted living supports. Additionally, the IEP team should consider how often and with what intensity does the student require direct individualized instruction to achieve gains on the Louisiana Connector standards. Sometimes in instruction, students need additional supports beyond those that are permissible in the statewide assessment. If the student requires the use of assistive technologies to actively engage and participate meaningfully and productively in daily activities in the home, school, work, community, IEP teams may want to consider information from AT evaluations too. This information is meant to help guide discussion, but ultimately it's the responsibility of the IEP team to make decisions regarding the level of supports a student needs to make academic progress and whether the student meets the requirements of Criterion 2 of the alternate assessment eligibility criteria. School systems have reached out with numerous questions regarding alternate assessment participation criteria and the revisions to Bulletin 1530. We've really tried to capture some of the more commonly asked questions. We're going to cover those over the next 3 slides. The questions and responses presented in the slides relates to work of both evaluation and IEP teams. The first question you see here says, what's the timeline for applying the new eligibility criteria, and how soon can we start? The department anticipates the new policy will go into effect for the 2019-2020 school year. Keep this in mind as you plan for evaluations, reevaluations, and IEP meetings. The second question says, do school systems need to do a reevaluation and administer a cognitive assessment for all students who qualified on adaptive scores alone? Not every student should be given an IQ or adaptive measure. This decision should be made with pupil appraisal staff and school psychologists. The team's decision is based on the reason for referral for a reevaluation and determined on a case-by-case basis. Evaluation decisions and instruments should be chosen in accordance with best practices. No one instrument should be recommended or required for use with all students. The last question on this slide says, what if it is impossible to assess a student because the student does not appear to communicate? The assessment process, including mode of communication, should be extensively documented and the decision explained. If you have to deviate from standardized administration of a cognitive measure, you should extensively describe what you did and always document this in the evaluation report. I think all pupil appraisal professionals know the golden rule: document, document, document. This is a very good case in which the golden rule becomes elaborately apparent. The first question we see here is, how should I document assessment scores for students when the evaluation team is unable to obtain a standard deviation score? Evaluation teams can report standard deviations from the mean scores as a range. IEP teams are able to use the lowest end of the range reported in the report as the score entered in SIR and used to make decisions regarding eligibility for the alternate assessment. In the rare instance a standard deviation score is not obtained and reporting a range is necessary for the evaluation report, it would be acceptable to use the eligibility criteria language from Criterion 1 in reporting commensurate cognitive functioning scores. For example, the student's level of cognitive functioning is commensurate with scores falling 3 or more standard deviations below the mean, or commensurate with scores falling no greater than 2 standard deviations below the mean. But remember that if a range is reported, the IEP team is able to use the lowest score reported in the range as a score entered in SIR used to determine eligibility for participation in the alternate assessment. The second question on this slide says, how do I know if the alternate assessment is appropriate for an English language learner with an IEP whose language proficiency makes it difficult to assess content, knowledge, and skills? An English language learner should be considered for the alternate assessment if the student's cognitive functioning indicates a significant cognitive disability, using assessments in the student's home language as appropriate, and the student meets the other participation guidelines for the alternate assessment. Assessment should take into account linguistic and sociocultural factors for valid interpretation of these assessments, alongside the information on goals and instruction in the student's IEP used to determine what may or may not be a significant cognitive disability. If an English language learner with an IEP does not meet the criteria for alternate assessment, he or she should take the general assessment with accommodations as appropriate. And the last question on the slide says, why is it important to indicate that a student participating in the alternate assessment is receiving instruction on content linked to grade level and his or her performance is being measured against alternate achievement standards or the Louisiana Connector standards. The decision to align a student's academic program to the Louisiana Connector standards aligned to grade level standards and participation in the LEAP Connect limits a student's direct contact with the breadth of the academic content for the grade level in which the student is enrolled. This limited or modified exposure to the grade level standards may impact academic outcomes and post-secondary opportunities. The last two common questions we compiled are shown here. The first one says, if a student is eligible to participate in the alternate assessment, but the team decides the student will not participate in the LEAP Connect, does this mean the student does not have to take a statewide assessment? Remember, federal law requires that all students participate in statewide assessments. If an eligible student does not participate in the LEAP Connect, they must participate in the regular assessment. And the last question says, if the school system receives a student from out of state with an IEP that indicates the student is eligible to participate in the alternate assessment, does the school system still need to conduct an evaluation? The school system needs to ensure they have the necessary information to determine eligibility based on Louisiana alternate assessment participation eligibility requirements found in Bulletin 1530. If the team does not have this information and suspects the student has a significant cognitive disability, then an evaluation may be necessary, and the school system should make this determination with their pupil appraisal staff. In concluding this webinar, I would like to say thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day to participate. Thanks again to both the Louisiana Psychological Association and the Louisiana School Psychological Association for contributing their time and expertise in the development of the content for this webinar. The webinar will be posted on our website in the Students with Disabilities Resource Library. In addition, the department has previously released the following tools and resources to help school systems: the Bulletin 1530 Preliminary Revisions Webinar Document, Alternate Assessment Eligible FAQ for IEP Teams. This document will be updated soon. Evaluation Updates and SIR Q&A for School Systems. SIR Evaluation Results and Alternate Assessment Eligibility Report. The department will release additional tools and resources in preparation for the 2019-2020 school year. A new alternate assessment hub on the Louisiana Believes website. SIR updates aligned to these approved revisions to alternate assessment eligibility criteria. A revised waiver process for school systems over the 1% participation threshold. For those of you who have included an email address with your questions in the chat box, we'll reach out via email with a response to those questions. If you have any additional questions, please email specialeducation@la.gov. Thanks again for your participation today.